Hello and welcome there to another episode of the Cliff Notes podcast, where we ask a leader and find their way. Today I've been joined by Ben Mosior, principal at Hired Thought, who's an expert in Wardley Mapping and helping leaders at all levels develop strategic competencies. Hi there today, Ben.
Hi, Tristan. Thanks for having me.
No, that's great. Thanks for sharing some time. I feel like I've been joining you on so many of these virtual calls and sort of mapping sessions and things. I thought it'd be nice to bring it out and bring it to this audience and that are dealing with change and planning and find out what we could do to help them. So maybe you can give us something a little bit more about you and what is this Wardley mapping thing?
Gotcha. Yeah. And first of all, it's really nice to be on the other side of the table for one of these. So I'm honored to be here. And I do a lot of content production, I think, around topics like Wardley mapping. I kind of think of myself as a bit of a purveyor of strange and interesting methodologies. So you'll find me playing with all sorts of tools and frameworks. And Wardley mapping is one that's caught my eye. And it just so happened that it was like it needed some love. It needed someone to step in and start building some of the, I think, tools and learning infrastructure around it to make it more accessible. Like there's a huge body of knowledge provided for free by the inventor of the framework, Simon Wardley. And I've kind of stepped into the role of how do we make this super accessible so that anyone can pick it up and play with it. So without belaboring it too long, what is it is a fair question. And Wardley mapping kind of does three things. First, it is a visual way of representing systems, kind of what the parts are. And we start with our users and what they need, and then all the components in our organizations and in the marketplace that come together through a web of relationships in order to provide and fulfill those needs. And it's a visual way of representing that. The second thing is it's a body of research around how things change under the forces of supply and demand competition. Simon calls this evolution. And so the qualities of things change as they're subjected to market forces, and the way that they are in terms of those qualities changes the way that we need to approach them. And that's really, really important in business. Otherwise, we start building things we ought not be building and buying things we ought not be buying. And it gets really messy sometimes. And then the third thing that Wardley mapping is, I think, is a strategic thinking framework, basically a kind of algorithm for examining the visuals that we make, understanding the patterns of the market forces, of which evolution is one, and then integrating that into a decision-making process that honestly has a lot of depth to it, and it's really hard to sum up. But I think it has a lot to do with just studying the way things are and understanding what is naturally possible as a result of the current disposition, and doing that first before trying to assert our will on the world. I think it's a critical kind of two-step moment there, and then the whole thing loops again. You discover new things, and it's lovely. So that's my best attempt at summing it up. How'd I do, Tristan?
No, I thought that was good. I've been following along. I do appreciate that it is hard for both for yourself and for the audience. We're talking about mapping and planning things out, and it's quite a visual sort of sharing thing. And I'm making you deliver this through the medium of audio. So we'll definitely share some pictures, and this is more of a sort of a way of understanding and getting. Why should you start looking at this? Because people, I would advise to get into some of your content or get into reading the book that's available online to get more of a visual feel of this as well. Sponsorship of this podcast has been brought to you by Holding Bay, the digital web agency. Holding Bay specialises in working with B2B companies like manufacturers to build better solutions and drive better sales funnels. So if you would like to build a web application or improve your branding and sales funnel, get in contact today. holdingbay.co.uk or call us on 01273 044 019. I've seen the power of getting everyone round the table of sort of sharing paper and pens and drawing out and planning for things, or up on a whiteboard or in a sort of a workspace situation where you've got data that's actionable, that's come off the floor, that people are using for whether they're driving machinery or computers or processes or what they're doing. But that visual piece can be helped to work with planning and the sort of strategic side, as well as sort of actionable in the moment data. I mean, is that where we're talking about is stuff's always in movement and always in play, and we're just trying to track what's happening to it. I mean, how are we going to pin this down?
Yeah, I think there's something important that you mentioned there, which comes into play. And I really want to be careful not to say things like, yeah, Wardley mapping is great for everything. But I do think it's a very flexible framework. And one of the ways that it's flexible is in the kind of time spans that are in the concern of whoever's in the room. I think executives we at least have this belief that they're thinking on multi-year time spans, and maybe that's going to look differently, and the maps that are made in those contexts are going to look differently than the maps made for a 2-week agile sprint or something like that, right? So thinking about how different people are engaging with the work, I think you can make maps of just about any context and just along any sort of dividing line like role or function and time spans of discretion and so on, because mapping, I think, is based on ontology. This philosophical understanding of what exists in the world and how it relates with itself, or with how different things relate to each other, and that makes it very flexible. I can make a map of just about anything, anything from like one of the recent live streams we did with Vesna Vukovic was mapping yoga. Like we can make a map about how yoga studios work or how yoga itself works. I've also made a map of my own career search. Like way back when I was leaving the corporate world and trying to figure out what to do, I made a map of, first of all, how to get hired, but also a map of myself, what I needed, what the parts are kind of conceptually that I have going on inside my head when I'm thinking about the work that I do. And it's really just a model of the world, and the beauty of models is that they're smaller than the world, and so we can pick them up and play with them and look at them from different angles and try adjusting little pieces of it and playing that out in our minds. It's just much easier to interact with the world that way than to either keep it all in our head and try to pretend that we understand it and that we don't have bounded cognition, or actually trying to literally pick up the entire world and play with it. I think making models is a much easier way of going about it, and mapping is one effective way of doing that. So, yes, lots of different ways you can come at it, but it is a really flexible framework for flexible purposes.
Hmm. And when we say mapping, I mean it's the sort of concept of moving something that is going to give you something that it could move in different directions. I mean, much like you might have a map to find your way across a country or across a town. That there are routes and things, but we're not talking about something that specifically got roads and street signs and things on. But there is direction and movement in it. I mean, when we're coming from, say, the audience here are maybe primarily around sort of manufacturing and sort of supply chain, is say a supply chain or a production process something that might be applied to a map?
I absolutely think so. Simon's pretty particular about what is or isn't a map, and I'm not so worried about that. But his whole thing is that the map is like it's a visual artifact that is specific to the context, and that you can represent the relative position of moving parts, and those parts are moving, right? They're not dead things. Like maybe you make a map and it's a slice of time in a moment of where things are today, but they might be changing, right? So there's movement involved, and one of the things I think about there is, mapping decides to focus the movement question in kind of two ways. One is the composition and arrangement of the value chain. So the value chain being, what are all the moving parts in the organization that come together to fulfill needs, and how are they interrelated? So like different compositions can exist, and different ways of fulfilling those user needs can exist across the market. But the second one, which is more obvious if you look at a Wordly map, is evolution. And evolution is like 4 stages. from Genesis to custom built to product and rental services to commodity and utility services. And there's this whole set of characteristics. Simon has this thing called the evolutionary characteristics cheat sheet that comes along with those, each of those four stages of evolution. And so you start to get an idea like things in stage one are high failure, they're really messy, and we don't understand them very well, but there's a high potential for future value, or rather the potential value of that thing is rather high, even though we're not certain whether or not it will live long enough to be useful in any way. And then meanwhile, on the opposite end of the spectrum, you've got things in stage four commodity that are kind of completely the opposite. Like they're very low failure, highly reliable, repeatable. Everybody understands exactly how they're supposed to work, and the value they provide is kind of like invisible. Like we almost devalue it because we don't even think about it. Like a good example of that would be something like street power or something like that for being able to make your computer work or whatever. But you're not thinking about 120 volts at 60 hertz or whatever your local country kind of voltage and frequency might be. You're not thinking about that. You're just using the computer, and power is kind of an afterthought. So appreciating the movement that's in play of every piece of your business, from concepts of how you do what you do from a process standpoint to knowledge that is backing those concepts up, that might be industry specific, or even like industry secrets, intellectual property, and so on, to the technologies that you're using. Everything is going through this movement, and it's inevitably put under this pressure. And it's either going to move to the right and evolve, or it's going to die out and be replaced by something else. So once you integrate an awareness that that's happening to the components, both in your business and in the equivalent components in the wider marketplace, you can start to just sort of start paying attention to that and noticing what realities that actually is going to subject you to. The decisions that you make are going to change the more you're in touch with that dynamic. And I think what Simon points out with his various tirades around corporate mismanagement or government mismanagement is the unawareness that this is even a thing. And so people are making decisions largely by what feels right or gut feeling.
So if I tied that back to say something like additive manufacture, 3D printing, this could have been something that's existing all the way on the left as a sort of research and development. Could this work? Don't know whether this works. And then it slowly moves into sort of some either a very expensive device or very experimental sort of simple device. And then as it slowly gets more production capable, more of a commodity, more achievable by more people, more usable by more people, it's going to move slowly to the right, and become more of a utility. But you're saying that the way to use maps and keep coming back to them, that they're simple things, simple, just drawn out and shared, but there's evolution, you were saying. So that's that idea of being able to, is it what you mean, of being able to see and plot where are these things changing and where might the market be moving in the next, I don't know, 5 years, 10 years, 100 years, because obviously you can choose what scale you work with.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the dynamic you described there with 3D printing is such a good example because like you can see the signals, right? You can see the fact that I mean, Simon was even writing about 3D printing, and it was a relatively rare kind of thing, where if you wanted to do 3D printing, you kind of had to build your own system, and that is a really good indicator that it's like a stage 2 custom built activity. Whereas in kind of where it is right now, I think in stage 3, there's an explosion of different offerings and ways, like all sorts of different 3D printers, all sorts of learning happening around the different way, like materials to use and so on. And so now we're kind of like in this moment where, okay, where might this be going? And you can look at the individual like parts of the 3D printer, like the modeling, the filament, like the setup and rigging that you have to use, everything down to like, do you need like a heating pad underneath the platform in order to make it easy to remove? Like removal techniques, practices of doing that. All of that stuff is examinable. And you can go as deep or as broad as you want just to zoom in or zoom out, but it's important to be aware of the fact that those things are moving to the right. And that leads you to this kind of interesting and tricky problem where you know that they're moving to the right, but you don't know when they're going to trip over the boundaries of, say, from stage 2 to stage 3 or from stage 3 to stage 4. But you can know what that sort of tripping over into looks like. Like if we're seeing an explosion of many varieties of the same kind of thing, like it's a decent chance that it's now stepped into stage 3. If things start to become more of a race to the bottom, where like you really were looking for like the one mega provider of 3D printing whatevers, right? Then we're really looking at something that's more like stage 4, right? So you can notice the signals. You might not know when that thing is going to happen, but you can notice its position to sort of tip into that moment and go, huh, we how would we ideally be behaving today if we were going to assume that's possible? And that, I think, is where some of these interesting discussions can go.
So it's sort of modeling the business, or modeling what might be possible, or what a future state of a business might be like, to help us predict or move there, or move away from that.
Yeah, and there's even like there's a book called The Punch Escrow by Tal Klein, where all he did to kind of invent a future scientific universe. Well, it wasn't all he did, of course, because he's a brilliant author, but like the work that he did to sort of seed some of those ideas was to basically make some Wardley maps and pretend like the things that might be in stages 1, 2, 3, or 4 today, um, just basically pretend that they're all in 4, and then what new things might become possible as a result. So like play this out, for example, with the 3D printing kind of idea. Okay, if it's escaped stage 1 into stage 2, and then escaped from stage 2 into stage 3 because there's this wide diffusion of various forms of the same thing. Well, let's imagine a future where we play this out and there's like a 3D printer on every corner, and it's from one main brand that seems to have dominated the market. And one of the economic patterns that Simon talks about along with evolution is that when there are highly evolved components in stage 4, for example, they become these kind of building blocks because they're highly certain, low failure, and they're kind of everywhere. They become building blocks for new weird stuff that people will start to do. So imagine a world where there's a 3D printer on every corner, and all you have to do to print something out is just tap a couple buttons on your phone, and it downloads the right model for you, and it even like adapts it to the sizes that you need, and it uses the right materials, and you can just print just about anything on demand. What kind of worlds become possible as a result of that? And it's really not particularly far fetched. I mean, you can kind of like I'm already imagining like people aren't selling things that are like made cheaply elsewhere, right? Now you're just going to print them locally, and it's like just in time manufacturing in a weird way. And so if I want 10 washers for a machining project that I'm doing in my garage, maybe I go, submit my order for a washer of the right type and just go pick it up at the store, or maybe it's even delivered by Amazon or something like that, right? This isn't very far-fetched at all. It's just when you play things out and make the assumption that something is now in stage 4 instead of stage 3, a whole new world opens up. And you can't know when that's going to happen again, but you can sort of imagine what becomes possible and prepare yourself to be ready for those kinds of possibilities.
You can see that happens with logistics and weights of, say, payloads going into space. I mean, it's expensive to ship parts and pieces up there, or know which parts might fail. And so they've been
Right.
experimenting with printing parts in space, or printing legacy parts. It's much easier to keep the plans, to keep the drawings, to keep the models, than it is to keep an infinite inventory of old parts for cars, for planes, for machinery. But if you can keep the models, and you know that you can get the quality and the tolerances output whenever you need them, there's that thing you could play out of, well, what if we didn't need the warehouse at this size? We just needed the raw materials and the plant and the parts, materials, details and specifications. Then we can either not have to ship them as far, we can just send the plans and have them made more locally, or we just don't need that inventory in the same way.
Right. And like inventory is money in like a traditional manufacturing sense because it's stuff that's not been delivered to customers. But like right now it's like a mission critical thing. in a space station context. And those kinds of outlier situations help us accelerate the development of these technologies. And that's going to have ripple effects. So it's like the future's already here. It's just not in the place that, where it affects you yet. It's only affecting, astronauts or what have you. But it, like, if in case people get the idea that this is only about futuring and far off stuff, just bluntly, whenever you examine the value chain of your existing organization, and again, the value chain is like whose needs are being served and what are the dependent parts of the system that's producing those needs. However many layers deep you have to go, what depends on what else to understand the full system of how that value gets delivered. Once you have that and you examine each part by evolution, well, you start to have some interesting questions about what should be built in-house and what should be managed in-house versus what should be outsourced or bought. And the unfortunate reality, I think, is in a lot of larger organizations, especially those I think that are going to be listening to this podcast, you have years and years of legacy and years of enmeshed, good value producing systems, but systems that are underperforming in comparison to what, say, a startup might be able to pick up and start doing out of nowhere, right? Because they don't have the existing commitments. And so when you examine your value chain, and you realize that, hey, there are a lot of providers for this component because it's in stage 3 now that we could use instead of building it in house. Like, it's no longer in stage 2. We had to build it when it was in stage 2, but now we've got all these providers that we could give this responsibility to. Well, what future do we want? Where do we want to put our limited time, attention, money, and resources? Is it on that thing that can now be provided by other people, or should we put it on something that's more differentiating? And so it's those little moments like that, like with basic build, buy, outsource questions, that I think can start to open some immediate doors. Not to mention like the methodology questions too. Simon talks a lot about agile versus lean versus Six Sigma, and the kind of secret is, well, they all are really great for particular contexts. And using mapping, you can sort of decide which context is a particular component is in, and which methodology options to use. So there's a lot of immediate practicality, not just the futuring stuff. And with anything, you got to take baby steps first with this kind of stuff. Get a little bit of value and build up some comfort with it before you feel like you have to go predict the future or anything. It's really accessible if you take the time.
And I mean, have you found that there's any particular challenges or particular things that you keep coming back to that are hard to model or are commonly needed to model, and they're just moving around a lot, or they're on everyone's mind? Do you think for the next sort of 3 to 5 years?
I mean, they're definitely, depending on the industry, there are these kind of buzzwords that you hear. Like, for instance, I hear a lot about transformation, like digital transformation or agile transformation or whatnot. I, also, things like basically buckets of concepts that get associated with a particular word, like artificial intelligence. I think there's a really really tricky thing whenever a word gets overloaded like that, where we can say, okay, what do you mean by that? Let's actually break that down. When you say that word, what activities, practices, data, knowledge, etc., is inside that bucket, inside that concept? Like, let's just break it down. Let's get some specific vocabulary so that when you say artificial intelligence or digital transformation or whatever the buzzword of the day might be, we know specifically what you mean. Oh, you mean digital transformation in terms of the outsourcing of commodity services like Active Directory, etc., to commodity suppliers. That's what you mean when you say digital transformation, not, for example, mobile first, or, for example, bring your own device. But sometimes in a different context, those other concepts might be the relevant concept. So it's really about, honestly, language creation. And I mean, it's a never ending problem in my view. Like, organizations kind of forget what the words mean, or they, different people have different versions of what those words should mean. And so really we're trying to have a common language around that stuff. But honestly, this is a never ending thing. People need to continuously notice and share and reinvent the language that they're using in their organizations. So it's not just a 3 to 5 year like current trends concern. It's honestly paying down the ongoing forgetting and oftentimes accidental word usage that is happening inside organizations, if we're not using words that make sense to each other, then we're kind of not communicating. And I think it's okay that people use different concepts and then use the same word to mean those different concepts. It's just sometimes we need to be more careful about noticing when those meanings shift, and kind of noticing when people are playing different games with those words. And that's a little nod to some Wittgenstein, if you want to go learn about some word philosophy. um, anyway, so yeah, lots of fun there.
I like that, and I like what you touched on there of forgetting things. That sometimes we want to be consistent. I mean, we always want to be consistent and make sure that we're understood and that we've delivered the right thing to the right people and we're on the same page. But there are some times where we need to know which things to forget or which things to depreciate, so that we can
Yeah,
also move that forward and improve it. I like that.
that's so important.
I mean, along this sort of lines of sort of thinking and improving and learning and keeping our minds active. I mean, do you have any sort of favorite books or tools that you're working with at the moment that you could share?
I have a couple that I'm really getting into, and they're a varied kind of set of interests. I think one that I has really been helpful to me recently is The Reflective Practitioner by Donald Schoen. And it's kind of a really interesting exploration of how we need to engage with both the work that we do, but also the thinking about the work that we do. So we need like a reflective moment in order to better process things. And there's it's a lovely exploration of what it means to be a professional and what it means to actually do work. Another one more aligned with kind of like the Wardley mapping side of things is Deciphering Sun by Derek McCun. It's just a fabulous exploration of kind of the differences between traditional views of strategy and well, I should say traditional Western views of strategy versus, say, a more interesting kind of Taoist approach, which I think is highly aligned with Wardley mapping. Keyword there being conditions consequences thinking. Absolutely fabulous way to think about the world as an ongoing organic thing, and how to approach strategy in a very different way. So 100% recommended from me.
No, that does sound great. I'll have to add those to my list too. I hadn't heard of these ones before.
Excellent.
Cool, cool. And we end with a little fun closer. If you were going to help one of your clients or people you're working with to don a superhero costume and grab one or two things to come out on top, is there any particular things that you would recommend that they grab or that would come to hand?
Ooh, that's a tough one. I think well, we're gonna do a different book recommendation then, because the last two are fascinating, but this one is critical. It's called Helping by Edgar Schein, and I find that to be an excellent manual for doing good work with people and learning how to be genuinely helpful in the world. And so, if I'm talking to leaders, I think leaders need to be helpful, not helpful. And there's an important difference there. And that book is probably one of the best explorations of that concept. But what else? I bet they could bring something else too, couldn't they? Honestly, I think a bottle of water wouldn't hurt them. Stay hydrated.
That's it. It's a good one. Good one. Cool. So, I mean, thanks for coming and giving us some time and diving into this subject that we now need to all get our papers and pen out and get an understanding of where to start and how to share and bring people to the table. I mean, where can we share in some more of your work and get in contact with you then, Ben?
Oh, thanks. I think if you want to learn something about Wardley mapping, well, you can go to a little website that I run called learnwardleymapping.com. There's lots of resources and videos and things on there. Or you could find me on Twitter at Hired Thought. And you can always say hi or DM me questions about mapping and things like that. I'm always happy to hear from folks.
And you also work with companies and things on a sort of more of the business side rather than the teaching side, do you as well?
I do a little bit of everything. I do have a background in consulting, and so I do still do some of that stuff. But I'm trying out some new things. I'm trying out some new things with coaching and also focusing on just being an educator, running public workshops and things like that. So I tend to pick up one hat and then put down another, and then seasons of life go by, and I go find those old hats and come back to it. So yeah, if you have questions or need help with this kind of thing in your organization, you can go to hiredthought.com, and there's a contact me form there. Always happy to hear from you. And if I can't help you, I'll find someone who can.
Thanks for your time then today, Ben, and we look forward to speaking again soon.
I had a great time, Tristan. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us again today on the podcast. If you'd like to get in contact with myself or the guest, you can always do that at the website cliffnotespodcast.com, or catch up with the latest episodes on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook. We always like to hear from you. So thank you, and we look forward to speaking to you again soon.